Double-stitched seam. Most of the garments are usually made with a straight seam. In the case of straight seam, there are chances that fabric may unravel as it is stitched only once. To prevent this and to strengthen it, the seam is given one more straight stitch right next to the first one. Thus, being stitched twice, it is called double-stitched seam. And it is this double-stitched seam that we are going to learn in this class. At the end of this class, you will be able to identify a double-stitched seam. So, a double-stitched seam. What is a double-stitched seam? The double-stitched seam is a plain seam. This is what it looks like. This stitch is a seam and edge finish especially good for sheers, such as chiffon or organza, and knits to create narrow seams. It helps to keep the seams flat. Besides, it also has a decorative aspect. As the name suggests, the double-stitched seam is stitched twice, and purpose of doing like this is to prevent the fabric from raveling. Now let's see how to do a double-stitched seam on a sample. Procedure of sewing a double-stitched seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: cotton fabric, straight ruler, pattern square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of cotton fabric. Measure and draw 10 by 10 square on it with the help of a ruler, pattern square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now take one of the fabric pieces and lay it on the table with its wrong side up. Using a tailor's square, measuring tape, and tailor's chalk, mark 1-inch seam allowance along one of its cut edges. Now pin the 2 pieces with the right side together with the marked seam line on the upper side. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Leave the reverse stitch lever and stitch along the seam line with a normal stitch length. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 4. Stitch again. Stitch again 1/8 inch away within the seam allowance using a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch. Here we are using the straight stitch. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors . Step 5. Trim the seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance close to the second row of stitching. Step 6. Press the seam allowance. Press the seam line with an iron. Then open the fabric so that the right sides of the fabric are no longer together. Now press the seam allowance to one side. Finally, you have your sample with a double-stitched seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching to the fabric. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. Double-stitched seam is a plain seam. It is a seam and edge finish. It helps to keep the seams flat. It is stitched twice to prevent the fabric from raveling. It has a decorative aspect to it too. The procedure of sewing the double-stitched seam, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Step 4. Stitch again. Step 5. Trim the seam allowance. Step 6. Press the seam allowance. This is the double-stitched seam. You have now learned all about the double-stitched seam. Take our next class to learn about the curved seam.